His own son thought he could slip something into his father's fishing box without being noticed. But 30 years as a Denver cop trained Thomas to see every twitch, every lie, every betrayal. The casual gesture looked innocent, yet it carried the weight of something dark, something that could shatter a lifetime in seconds. Shock hit harder than a bullet when Thomas realized the hand that once clung to him as a boy was now planting destruction. What would you do if your own child tried to ruin you? Comment below and subscribe, because what Thomas discovered next will leave you breathless. The garage was quiet again after Michael's footsteps faded, but Thomas couldn't shake the weight pressing against his chest. The tackle box sat on the bench like a silent accomplice transformed from a tool of peace into a container of menace. It wasn't just a box anymore. It was a ticking clock, an unanswered question, a threat wrapped in silence. His instincts whispered that whatever his son had placed inside wasn't meant to help him, wasn't meant for fishing. It was meant to burn his life down. The thought alone tightened his grip on the workbench until his knuckles turned pale. He tried to focus on the ordinary things around him, the faint smell of motor oil, the way sunlight cut through dusty windows, the row of tools neatly hung on the wall. These had always been symbols of control, of order. But none of it mattered now because his son's shadow had crept into this sacred space and poisoned it. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, louder than the distant hum of traffic. His eyes kept darting back to the box. Every second it remained closed was another second of torment. Still, he didn't open it. Not yet. Years on the force had taught him one rule: don't move until you're ready. He needed to think, to measure, to step back from the raw sting of betrayal. He replayed Michael's movements in his head, the awkward cheer in his voice, the nervous sweat on his forehead, the way his shoulders hunched like a man burying secrets. It hadn't been clumsy. It had been deliberate. His son had planted something with precision, and that precision chilled him more than anything. The memories of the past months pressed against him like shards of glass. Michael's short temper, the constant requests for money, the hollow excuses about job hunting. Thomas had brushed them aside as grief or stress blind by choice because he wanted to believe there was still a trace of the boy his late wife had begged him to protect. But the truth was crawling to the surface now, forcing him to see. His son was walking a path of darkness, and he was dragging his father with him. Thomas poured himself a cup of coffee, though his hands shook enough to slosh liquid over the rim. He sat at the small table in the corner of the garage, the box always in his line of sight. He thought of Sarah, how she used to bring him sandwiches on these mornings, smiling as she teased him about spending more time with hooks and lures than with people. She would have known what to say now. She would have known how to calm the storm in his chest. But she was gone, and he was left with silence, a silence broken only by his own uneasy breathing. The cup clinked against the table when he set it down. He rose, pacing, circling the tackle box as if it were a predator crouched in the dark. He bent close, almost expecting to hear it ticking. He wanted to tear it open to see the truth, but the thought of what might be inside held him back. A weapon, drugs, evidence of a crime, each possibility was worse than the last. And if Michael had planted it, it meant he wanted his father destroyed. That single thought gnawed at him like acid. He walked to the back door, cracked it open, and stared at the driveway where Michael's car had been parked earlier. The space was empty now, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that even the gravel still held his son's deceit. He closed the door, locked it, then leaned his back against the wood as if bracing for an impact. He wasn't just dealing with a reckless kid anymore. He was dealing with someone dangerous, someone desperate. The clock on the wall ticked, a reminder that every minute he hesitated could be another step closer to ruin. He forced himself back to the workbench, staring down at the box. It looked so ordinary, the same weathered green metal he had carried on countless trips to lakes across Colorado. But now it carried a different weight, a different story. His fingers hovered over the clasps, then withdrew. Not yet. He needed to be smarter. Instead, he reached for his phone and pulled up the Secure Notes app where he had documented dozens of cases over the years. Old habits resurfaced. He began typing observations. Michael's demeanor, his suspicious actions, the moment of concealment. He wrote it as though building a case because, in truth, that's what he was doing. Only this time the suspect wasn't a stranger. It was his son. He sat back and read over the words. Each line cut deeper than the last. His stomach churned with dread, but his resolve hardened. He would not allow himself to be blindsided. If Michael had set a trap, then Thomas needed to be ready when it snapped shut. And it would. He could feel it like static in the air before a storm. When he finally stood and shut off the lights, the garage sank into shadow. The tackle box remained on the bench, glowing faintly under the sliver of moonlight cutting through the window. Thomas paused at the door, his hand on the switch, staring at that box, like it held the power to decide his fate. His instincts told him that opening it now would reveal the truth too soon before he was prepared. He needed to wait to let Michael's choices expose themselves fully. As he climbed the stairs into the house, the unease followed him. Every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the siding sounded sharper, like the house itself was warning him. He poured another cup of coffee in the kitchen, but it tasted bitter metallic, like guilt and fear mixed together. He carried it to his study, sat in his leather chair, and stared at Sarah's photo. He whispered aloud, more to himself than to her memory, that something was coming, something neither of them could have imagined. The night stretched long, restless. He dozed in the chair, haunted by half-dreams of flashing lights, of police sirens, of Michael's face twisted with something unrecognizable. When dawn finally pushed against the curtains, his body was stiff but his mind was sharper. He rose, went back to the garage, and looked at the box again. The sun painted it gold, but there was nothing warm in the sight. It was still there, waiting. He didn't touch it, not yet. Instead, he whispered into the stillness, a vow carried only by the dust and sunlight. Whatever his son had set in motion, Thomas would be ready. He would not go down quietly. He would not let betrayal write the final chapter of his life. And as the silence thickened, he knew the moment of revelation was drawing closer. What hid inside that box wasn't just an object. It was a line that, once crossed, would change everything between father and son forever. The real storm hadn't even begun. The bitter taste of memory clung to him as he sat alone in the dim light of his kitchen, replaying every second of the dinner that now felt like a prelude to disaster. The night before had begun with the faint smell of grilled chicken drifting through the house, the kind of ordinary ritual Thomas had clung to since Sarah's passing. He had tried to make the evening normal, casual, even setting the table, while the October wind rattled the windows. But nothing about Michael's presence at that table had been normal. His son's eyes were hollow, the muscles in his jaw tight, as if clenched against some invisible vice. Thomas could still see the way Michael pushed food around his plate, his fork dragging lines through mashed potatoes he never ate. He had looked smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched, his skin pale under the tired kitchen light. And then, without warning, the words fell from his mouth like stones. "Dad, I need $50,000. There was no hesitation, no soft let-in, no apology. Just a number so heavy it sucked the air from the room. Thomas remembered setting his fork down, his mind racing. 50,000 wasn't just a plea for help, it was an ultimatum. He studied his son's face, searching for the boy he had raised, the boy Sarah had adored. But what looked back at him was something older, harder, and edged with desperation. His hands had trembled as he reached for his glass of water. He had seen addicts in interrogation rooms, hustlers on the street corners of Denver, gamblers who would pawn their mother's ring for one more night at the tables. The look in Michael's eyes was no different. He had tried to keep his voice steady when he answered, "Michael, I don't have that kind of money." But his son had leaned forward, his fingers drumming the table with an agitation that sent alarms firing in his father's chest. "You don't understand," Michael snapped, his voice cracking. "These people aren't patient. They won't wait." His eyes darted to the window as if someone might be listening from outside. It was then Thomas realized this wasn't about missed rent or overdue bills. This was about something far darker. The argument had spiraled quickly. Thomas pressed for details, but Michael only grew angrier, his words sharp and bitter. He slammed his chair back from the table, the scrape of wood on tile echoing through the house like a warning shot. "Forget it. I'll figure it out myself," he had spat before storming up the stairs, leaving half-eaten food, and a silence that suffocated the room. Alone at the table, Thomas had sat frozen, staring at the empty chair across from him. The smell of charred chicken, once comforting, now soured in his stomach. He replayed Michael's words again and again. People. Not a person. People. Whoever they were, they had their claws deep in his son, and Michael was terrified. Terrified enough to beg. Terrified enough to lash out. Terrified enough to risk everything. The house had been restless that night. Thomas had stood at the sink washing dishes, his ears straining to the sounds above. Michael's footsteps paced across the floorboards of his room, the creak of each step tight with urgency. Muffled voices bled through the ceiling phone calls in tones too low to catch but too urgent to ignore. At one point he had caught fragments. "I just need more time and don't do anything yet." Words that cut sharper than knives. That unease had followed him into his study, where he sat with the television murmuring in the background, but his mind elsewhere. He had pulled out Sarah's photograph, holding it as if she could answer the questions that clawed at him. What would she have done? She had always been the soft one, the peacemaker, the bridge when father and son clashed. But even Sarah would have recognized the danger in Michael's voice, the way desperation had hollowed him out. Sleep had come in fits, broken by the slam of a door somewhere in the night, and the unmistakable sound of a car engine starting. He had checked the clock, nearly midnight, as Michael's headlights disappeared down the street. Thomas had stood at the window long after the car was gone, his reflection staring back at him like a stranger. When Michael finally returned hours later, he slipped back inside without a word, his shoes squeaking faintly on the floorboards. Now, replaying it all in the harsh clarity of morning, Thomas saw the signs with painful precision. He should have known the request wasn't just about money. He should have recognized the tremor in Michael's hands, the twitch of his jaw, the sharpness in his tone. He had interrogated hundreds of suspects, broken liars with nothing but silence and patience, and yet here in his own house, he had allowed himself to be blinded. By love. By hope. By the ghost of a promise to a dying wife who had begged him to protect their son at all costs. The guilt gnawed at him like teeth. He had said no to Michael, but maybe it hadn't been enough. Maybe no had been the trigger that sent his son into reckless territory. The memory of the slammed chair echoed louder in his mind now, not as anger but as a warning, the sound of a line being crossed. He glanced at the tackle box sitting on the workbench, its metal surface dull under the garage light. The box had become more than just storage. It was a message. Michael hadn't asked for help anymore. He had made a move. And Thomas understood the silent language of moves better than most. He had seen criminals bluff, he had seen them fold, and he had seen them go all in. Michael had gone all in. The truth cut deep. His son wasn't simply in trouble. He was trapped in a vice pressured by people who didn't care about blood or family. People who would destroy anyone who stood in their way. And Michael, in his desperation, had chosen to drag his father into the line of fire. Thomas sat back down, his eyes never leaving that box. He felt the shift inside him, the slow crawl of realization hardening into resolve. This wasn't just about saving his son anymore. It was about survival. He had carried a badge long enough to know when the ground beneath him was ready to collapse. He whispered into the silence words only the walls could hear. "It's starting." And deep down, he knew the next step would tear open truths far darker than he was ready to face. The worst was still waiting, coiled tight in the shadows, ready to strike. The clasps gave way with a metallic snap that echoed through the garage, louder than it should have been, like a judge's gavel striking down on his life. Thomas lifted the tray of lures, hands steady, but only because he forced them to be. The breath in his chest burned as he pulled back the tissue paper. What lay beneath was not a fishing tool, not some innocent trinket, but a clear plastic bag filled with white powder. He didn't need a test kit. 30 years in law enforcement had seared that image into his mind. Fentanyl. Potent enough to kill a dozen men with a trace, potent enough to destroy every shred of his reputation if it was found in his possession. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even blink. The world shrank to the weight of that bag in his hand, heavier than lead, though it was only ounces. His mind tried to rebel, tried to conjure up another explanation. Maybe Michael hadn't known what it was. Maybe it was meant for someone else. But lies collapsed under the truth, and the truth was merciless. His own son had hidden poison in his father's sanctuary. Not carelessly, not accidentally. Deliberately. The betrayal pierced deeper than any bullet ever could. He remembered the day Sarah had placed the newborn boy in his arms, his tiny fingers gripping Thomas's thumb with fierce trust. He remembered teaching him to ride a bike, steadying the handlebars, running alongside him until the boy had pedaled free with a laugh of victory. He remembered nights spent bandaging scraped knees, giving stern lectures softened with a smile, telling him he would always be safe under this roof. That roof now felt like a cage, and the boy he had raised had become the architect of his downfall. His knees gave way, and he sank onto the workbench stool, the bag trembling in his hand. He felt his pulse hammering against his skull. This wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. Michael had wanted this to be found not by him, but by someone else. The police, a neighbor, anyone who could tie it to him. Intent to distribute. A federal charge. Prison. His name stripped, his pension gone, his reputation burned to ash. All so Michael could walk away clean. The garage seemed to tilt around him, walls bending under the weight of the revelation. He pressed the bag flat against the table, forcing himself to breathe. His training fought with his grief. On the streets he had learned to stay detached, to process evidence without letting emotion cloud judgment. But this was no street case. This was blood. This was betrayal laced into his veins by the same son he had sworn to protect. He whispered into the silence, "Why Michael?" The name cracked in his throat, tasting of ash and regret. He wanted to rage, to storm into his son's room and shake the truth out of him. But rage would get him nowhere. Rage would leave fingerprints, evidence, mistakes. He had to think like the detective he once was, even if it meant treating his own child as a suspect. The fentanyl caught the light from the garage window, glinting like a cruel prize. He imagined the headlines, the whispers among neighbors, the disappointment in Sarah's eyes if she could see what her son had become. A lifetime of service reduced to nothing by a boy who bore his name. The pain sharpened into something cold, something steadier than grief. Resolve. He rewrapped the bag in its tissue, sliding it back into the box for the moment. His mind raced with possibilities. He could destroy it, flush it, pretend it had never existed, but that would solve nothing. Michael's actions wouldn't stop. They would escalate. This wasn't just a cry for help. This was a move in a game where Thomas had been cast as the sacrifice. If he destroyed the evidence, he destroyed his only chance of proving what Michael had tried to do. Every instinct screamed at him to take control. He thought of the oaths he had sworn as a cop, the countless hours he had spent dismantling criminal schemes. He had been trained to survive, to outthink, to outmaneuver. And now survival meant accepting the bitter truth: his own son had become the enemy. He rose from the stool, pacing the length of the garage. Each step steadied him, each breath pushing the shock further away and drawing determination closer. The betrayal still seared, but beneath it a strategy began to form. He would need to listen, to watch, to follow Michael's next moves with the precision of a hunter. Because one thing was certain: Michael hadn't finished. Planting the fentanyl was only the first step. He paused at the window, staring out at the street bathed in late afternoon light. Families walked dogs, kids pedaled bikes. Life moved as if nothing had changed. But for Thomas, everything had. He turned back to the tackle box, its surface dull and unassuming, yet hiding the kind of secret that could end him. He whispered again, softer this time, almost to himself. "You thought I wouldn't notice. You thought I'd fall." The sound of the front door opening jolted him upright. Michael's voice drifted down the hall, casual, careless, as if he hadn't just tried to destroy his father's life. Thomas quickly closed the tackle box. His hands calm now, his expression blank. He knew what he had to do. The game had started, and the next move was coming fast. And deep in his gut he knew the worst revelations had yet to surface, the kind that would rip apart the last illusions of family and force him to face a truth far darker than he was prepared for. The signs had been there all along, scattered across months like broken glass he had refused to step on. The weight loss that hollowed out Michael's face, the trembling in his hands when he thought no one was watching, the restless nights behind a locked door. Thomas had noticed, of course he had, but he addressed those wounds in softer explanations. Stress, grief, the endless search for work. He had told himself his son was weathering storms the way men sometimes do, stumbling but still on his feet. Now, with the fentanyl still fresh in his mind, every excuse unraveled, leaving only one brutal truth. Michael was an addict. The word rang in his head like the crack of a gunshot. He had spent a career dragging addicts off street corners, zipping up the bodies of those who hadn't survived, staring into the vacant eyes of teenagers who had overdosed on a bathroom floor. But none of those faces had been his son's. None of those shaking hands had been the ones he had held on the first day of kindergarten, the ones he had guided on a fishing line. Now every memory carried the stain of betrayal. The image of Michael slipping that package into the tackle box replayed in his mind, deliberate, rehearsed like a criminal executing a plan. The betrayal wasn't just in the drugs, it was in the manipulation. The endless requests for money, the frantic calls about overdue bills, the half-truths muttered through clenched teeth. Thomas had opened his wallet again and again, convincing himself that love meant patience, that loyalty meant sacrifice. But love hadn't saved Michael. It had only given him tools to dig the pit deeper. Sitting in his study later that night, Thomas stared at Sarah's photograph on the mantel. Her eyes, frozen in that eternal moment of warmth, seemed to question him. He could almost hear her voice. "Be patient, Thomas. He needs you." He had honored that plea for 3 years, giving Michael space-time, chance after chance. Now patience felt like complicity. He rubbed his face rough with stubble and whispered into the dark, "I don't even know him anymore." He thought about the small details, the ones he had ignored because they hurt too much to face. The way Michael avoided eye contact at dinner, staring at his plate as if the truth might spill out if he looked his father in the eye. The missing items in the house tools from the garage, his watch from the dresser, cash from the kitchen drawer that always seemed to vanish without explanation. He had wanted to believe it was forgetfulness, mistakes, anything but theft. Now he knew better. Addiction wasn't just a hunger. It was a fire that consumed everything: trust, dignity, family, and left only ashes. He closed his eyes, the weight pressing down on his chest until he thought it might crush him. He had chased killers down alleys, faced men armed with knives and guns, and never once had he felt the helplessness he felt now. Because those men were strangers. He hadn't loved them. He hadn't promised a dying woman he would protect them. But Michael was his blood, and that made this fight unbearable. Thomas pushed himself up from the chair and walked to the window. The neighborhood was quiet, houses glowing softly in the autumn night, families safe behind locked doors. Somewhere above he could hear Michael pacing again, his voice muffled on another phone call, sharp and clipped with desperation. Thomas couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. He knew the sound of a man begging for more time, for one last chance. He had heard it in interrogation rooms, in courtrooms, in alleys behind liquor stores. Now it was echoing in his own home. The bitter truth settled in: Michael hadn't just stumbled into this. He had embraced it. He had chosen the path step by step until it had twisted him into someone who could plant fentanyl in his father's tackle box without blinking. The realization tore through Thomas's chest like a blade. His son hadn't just fallen. He had become the very thing Thomas had spent his life fighting against. He gripped the window frame, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. His own eyes looked older, harder, rimmed with exhaustion. He had seen countless fathers crushed by this same truth, men sitting in courtrooms with faces carved by shame as their children were sentenced. He used to think he understood them. He hadn't. Not until now. The house was silent again, but it was the wrong kind of silence. It wasn't peace. It was anticipation, a pause before the next blow. He turned back toward the garage where the tackle box still sat like a coffin waiting to be nailed shut. He pictured detectives standing in that very space pulling the fentanyl from its hiding place, handcuffs closing around his wrists while Michael stood in the doorway playing the grieving son. The thought made his stomach twist. He sank back into the chair, hands clasped tight, the ache of sorrow battling the spark of fury. He had loved his son too much to see the truth. That love had blinded him, and blindness had nearly cost him everything. Now the blindness was gone, replaced by a sharp, merciless clarity. Michael wasn't just in danger. Michael was the danger. And yet beneath the cold certainty, a sliver of grief gnawed at him. Because even now, even knowing what his son had done, part of him still wanted to believe Michael could come back from the edge. He wanted to believe there was a way to salvage the boy he had once known. But another part, darker and louder, whispered the truth he couldn't ignore. Redemption might no longer be possible. Thomas leaned forward, his voice low as if confessing to the night itself. "I tried, Sarah. God knows I tried." His words dissolved into the silence unanswered. He rubbed his hands together, the familiar motion of a man preparing for something inevitable. The signs had been there, and he had ignored them. Now they were too loud to dismiss. The weight loss, the lies, the desperation, it all pointed to one grim conclusion. His son wasn't just spiraling. He was willing to sacrifice his father to save himself. Thomas sat there in the darkness, the ache of betrayal heavy in his bones, knowing one thing with absolute certainty. The next move was coming, and when it did, it would force him to decide whether love was stronger than survival. And in that moment, he wasn't sure which he would choose. The walls of the house carried sound differently at night. Wood and plaster that usually muffled noise seemed to betray secrets when the hour was late, and Thomas had learned to listen in ways only a cop could. That night, the faint murmur of Michael's voice cut through the floorboards. At first it was just a rhythm, the rise and fall of a man pacing, but then came the names. Marco, Elena. Names that did not belong to friends or co-workers or anyone who could lift his son out of the spiral. These were names that carried weight, the kind of weight that left bodies in alleys and debts carved into flesh. He killed the lamp in his study and sat in the dark ears, straining. The house had become an amplifier, every word Michael spit into the phone dripping down through vents and cracks. "I said I'll get it," his son hissed, his voice sharp, almost panicked. "He won't notice. The house is enough. 80 grand. It covers it." The words sank like lead into Thomas's chest. He pressed his back against the chair, fighting the urge to storm upstairs and rip the phone from his son's hand. But the detective in him knew better. Evidence first, confrontation later. His jaw tightened as he pieced it together. Forgery. Identity theft. His son's voice low and frantic, promising assets he had no right to offer. Michael had taken his father's name, his signature, and sold it to predators. And the house, his house, the one Sarah had poured her soul into, was on the line. The memory of Sarah standing in the kitchen flashed before him, sunlight on her face as she painted the cabinets a soft cream color. She had called it their forever home. And now, without her voice to fill these rooms, their son had leveraged it like a poker chip. Rage boiled in his veins, hot and electric. This wasn't just betrayal. It was desecration. He rose from the chair and paced the room, fists clenched, listening as Michael's desperation poured out in fragments. "Marco, please. Just another week. Elena said it was fine. No, he won't find out. He's old. He doesn't check things." The cruelty of that sentence cut deeper than any insult. Old. Doesn't check things. His own son gambling on his blindness, betting that grief and age had dulled the instincts of a man who had once cracked gangs with a glance. Thomas crossed to his desk, yanked open a drawer, and pulled out an old recorder. One of those battered devices left over from his years interrogating suspects. He pressed record and set it on the desk, capturing every damning word. Evidence. If this escalated, if the house truly was tied in chains of debt, he would need proof. He would need to show, that the hand signing those papers hadn't been his. Michael's voice dropped lower, strained. "Tell Elena the money's coming. I got a plan. He doesn't have a clue. 80 grand plus interest, it's fine. I'll handle it." A door slammed upstairs. Footsteps paced back and forth, the ceiling creaking under each heavy stride. The phone call ended with a final desperate plea. "Just don't send anyone here," before silence returned. Thomas stood frozen, staring at the ceiling, as if he could burn a hole through the floor to see his son's face. The fury that swelled in him was almost unbearable. This wasn't a child begging for help anymore. This was a man trading his father's life, his father's home, for another fix, another chance at survival in a game that could only end one way. He went to the file cabinet tucked in the corner of the study and pulled out a folder labeled simply "House." Inside were mortgage statements, insurance documents, the deed itself. He laid them across the desk, scanning signatures, dates, numbers. His hand froze when he spotted it, his name scrawled in ink on a loan agreement dated 2 weeks ago. But the pen strokes were wrong. Too fast, too uneven. A mimicry. Not his hand. His son's. The room swayed around him, nausea twisting his gut. $80,000. He whispered the number aloud, each syllable sour. It wasn't just debt. It was shackles. Marco and Elena weren't bankers. They were wolves circling closer each time blood scented the air. His son had fed them the house as bait had gambled with the roof over his father's head. The betrayal felt total. There was no corner of his life left untouched, no memory unsullied. Michael had reached into the very foundation of his family and poisoned it with greed, lies, and addiction. Thomas pressed his palms against the desk, his arms trembling, staring at the forged signature until it blurred. He had seen men lose everything on less. He had seen families crumble because of debt smaller than this. And now his own home, his sanctuary, stood on the edge of being torn apart because his son had sold it to devils. He sank back into the chair, the recorder still blinking red on the desk. Every word captured, every lie preserved. For the first time in years, tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, not from weakness, but from rage too great to contain. He clenched his fists until his nails bit into his palms. He whispered, "You stole my name." The house was quiet again, but it was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, every wall echoing with the weight of betrayal. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the dark. His son had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And somewhere deep in his chest, under the ache of heartbreak, the detective stirred again. Because if Michael thought his father was blind, if he thought age and grief had softened him, he was wrong. Very wrong. The game had shifted. And Thomas knew the next revelation would cut deeper, dragging him into a darkness even his years on the force hadn't prepared him to face. He moved with the quiet precision of a man who had spent decades reading footprints in snow. Every motion was measured, economical, without the tremor that had marked his first shock. The garage light cast long, patient shadows across the concrete as he set the plastic bag back in the tackle box and closed the lid with careful hands. It was as if he had resealed a wound that could still bleed if mishandled. He did not destroy the evidence. He did not throw it away into the night like a man who wanted to forget. He protected it. He cataloged it. He turned it into leverage. He cleaned the box as if preparing a crime scene for another investigator. Using lint-free cloths he kept in the shed, he wiped fingerprint smudges, any microscopic trace that might betray his presence. His movements were clinical, methodical, the same hands that had once steadied an 8-year-old on a bicycle now performing the same steadying on a different kind of instrument. He vacuumed the inside of the bench, brushed out the grooves with a small, soft bristled brush, and then polished the clasps until they reflected the bare bulb overhead. To an ordinary passerby, the tackle box looked untouched. To a trained eye, it was a clean plate waiting for the next trace to fall. He took photographs with a battered old camera from his evidence locker, careful to capture angles and lighting that would later corroborate his version of events. He labeled each image in a small private notebook with the steady hand of old habit. Date, time, condition. Nothing sentimental, nothing wasted on emotion. This was containment. This was procedure. He had learned that in the dark stretches of an investigation order was a lifeline. He would not hand his life back to chaos. Then he turned his attention to Michael's car. The Civic sat where his son had left it earlier, the hubcaps dusty, the interior bearing the faint imprint of a life half-lived in haste. Thomas opened the trunk and felt the cool metal rim under his palms. He did not rush. He slid a pair of latex gloves onto his hands, the white rubber hissing against his skin like a whisper. He had one shot to rearrange the scene without planting a single lie. He needed the truth to be the weapon, not a forgery of it. He wrapped the fentanyl in the same tissue, then another, then tucked it inside a small sealed plastic container he kept for fishing weights. He placed the container deep against the wheel well under the gym bag and beneath an old blanket. He positioned it so that it would be discovered in the most incriminating place inside the driver's personal space, not buried in a communal tool area. He imagined the agents prying the flash of lights, the first officer's hand reaching into that exact spot and finding the bag where logic would point. The plan was surgical, not cruel. It was a mirror held up to whatever Michael had hoped to mirror against him. Once the narcotic was hidden, Thomas wiped the trunk interior with the same forensic fastidiousness. He used an alcohol wipe on the rubber seals, scoured the carpet fibers with a toothbrush, and then vacuumed the whole space with a small handheld unit he used to clean his truck. He ran a magnet over the spare tire area to make sure nothing metallic would betray their work, and then he placed the gym bag back with a casualness he had practiced 100 times. The car now told a story that matched any narrative Michael might spin about carelessness and panic. It told a different truth, though the truth of someone who had been framed. He set the camera to record a short clip of the trunk before he closed it, the angle chosen so that any subsequent search would match the image he had captured. He stored the memory card in his wallet under the license and the small laminated photo of Sarah he always carried. In those minutes he found a strange solace. It was not joy. It was not satisfaction in the way men celebrate victory. It was the sharp clarity of someone who had reclaimed the map of his life and refused to be erased from it. That night he listened as he had listened before, only now under a new light. He let Michael return, let him speak on the phone and pace and plead. He let those desperate calls thread themselves into the household air and be captured in the recorder tucked into the study drawer. He did not confront. He watched and recorded, cataloging tone, collecting cadence, building a dossier he could show a judge if the world demanded proof. Anger lived in his chest, but it sat quiet, not rage, but a focused, icy purpose. In the quiet hours he called an old colleague. The voice on the other end of the line was an anchor. He requested a favor and phrased it as a professional question disguised as casual curiosity about an old case technique. He asked about chain of custody protocols, about how best to document a situation in which a family member stood accused by another family member. The exchange was brief, functional. It provided him a legal frame for what he planned next. He understood the danger of stepping outside the boundaries of law, even in pursuit of survival. He would not cheat the system he had spent his life defending, but he would use its mechanisms. He laid out contingencies on the workbench like tools. Contact an attorney. Prepare financial records to contest any forged documentation. Copy bank statements, sign and seal a notarized affidavit, noting his memory of signatures, dates. He made a list of witnesses, neighbors who rarely missed a face on the street, the man who repaired his roof last month, the dry cleaner who still remembered Michael bringing clothes in late at night. He thought of the woman at the diner who had seen Michael at 3 a.m. that week. The taxi driver who recalled a cabbie ride to a sketchy part of town. He began the quiet business of building an alibi for his sanity. He rehearsed his words for when the officers arrived. He practiced the calm voice he would need to keep the room under control, the steady cadence that would prevent blood or breath from shaking his testimony. He knew that when a storm breaks, the first moments decide the shape of everything that follows. He would show composure. He would show documented proof. He would show that nothing in his life had been left to chance. He was building an immovable foundation under the feet of a man who had hoped to take it away. When dawn crept through the narrow garage window, he sat for a long time on the workbench and let the small rituals of the morning unspool. Coffee, a cigarette, he did not smoke, a quiet assessment of the evidence in front of him. The house still slept. Michael would wake and his son would carry on, oblivious that the scene had been rearranged, that the board had been reset for the next move. Thomas felt no triumph in that. Only the solemn armor of a man who had decided to survive on his own terms. He closed his eyes and thought of Sarah's laugh in summer light. He thought of the boy who had once made him proud by catching his first trout. He felt the double weight of grief and resolve, love that refused to be exploited, pain that would not dissolve into forgiveness without truth. The plan had been executed, every detail attended to. Now the waiting began. He would not sleep easily. He would not surrender. He would watch the house like a hawk watches a field patient, unblinking and ready to move when the next piece fell into place. Outside, the day cleared. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked, a lawnmower sputtered, life breathing on as if nothing had changed. Inside, the quiet had a different texture. It hummed with the anticipation of revelation. The next phone call would come. The next knock would sound at the door. The next move would be made. He had laid his own trap, as precise as any he had ever dismantled, and now he waited to see who would step into it. The answer would not be gentle. The call came mid-morning, sharp and unexpected. 2 cruisers rolled up the street, their engines idling like predators outside the house. Thomas stood at the window and watched Michael point toward the garage with the casual arrogance of a man who thought he'd already won. His son's voice carried just enough for Thomas to catch the words, rehearsed and venomous. "He keeps it in his tackle box. I saw it myself." The betrayal cut deeper than before, because now it wasn't whispers in the dark or forged signatures, it was public, loud, official. Michael had put the nail in the coffin with his own hand. Thomas's jaw locked as the agents walked up the drive, DEA windbreakers crisp against the autumn chill. They knocked once before stepping inside, warrants in hand, eyes already scanning the layout of the home. Thomas said nothing, only nodded, letting them do their work. He had been on the other side of this scene countless times. He knew the rhythm, the split of a team, one upstairs, one down, a third assigned to secure the target item. He stood in the living room, arms crossed, his breathing calm, though every muscle in his body coiled tight. In the garage, they found the tackle box exactly where Michael had promised it would be. An agent set it on the workbench, snapped the clasps, and began pulling out trays of lures. Michael hovered near the doorway, barely concealing a smile. He thought this was the moment. He thought he had his father cornered, ruined, destroyed. But the box was clean. The cloths Thomas had used had erased everything, leaving nothing but hook sinkers and the faint smell of oil. The agent rifled deeper, his brows furrowing. He lifted every compartment, tapped the bottom, ran his fingers along the seams. Nothing. He glanced at his partner and shook his head. The silence that followed was heavy, stretched taut like wire. Michael's expression faltered, a shadow of confusion breaking through his confidence. He opened his mouth to speak, but Thomas saw it. Then the flicker of nerves, the realization that his perfect trap had just sprung backward. "Check the vehicles," the lead agent ordered. It was routine. Every search extended outward, every possibility exhausted. They moved to Michael's Civic, parked crooked in the drive. The trunk popped open and the smell of old fabric and sweat wafted out. The agent knelt, pushed aside the gym bag, and felt along the wheel well. His hand stopped. His expression shifted. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out the container, the tissue wrapping still intact. He unsealed it, and the glint of white powder shone in the sunlight. "Fentanyl," he said flatly. The air seemed to collapse in on itself. Michael's face drained of color, his bravado gone in an instant. He stammered, words tumbling incoherent. "That's not mine, he must have." But the agents weren't listening. Their training taught them to trust evidence, not excuses, and the evidence lay heavy in their hands. Thomas stood on the porch watching as the cuffs clicked around his son's wrists. He felt no triumph, no joy in the spectacle. Only a grim satisfaction, the cold clarity of justice finally aligning. The world had tilted against him for weeks, betrayal after betrayal, but now the balance was restored. His name was no longer the one in question. His record, his reputation remained intact. The weight that had threatened to crush him lifted, replaced by something sterner, sharper vindication. Michael shouted as they led him toward the car, his voice high, desperate. "Dad, tell them it's not mine." The words carried across the street, drawing neighbors to their windows. Thomas didn't move. He didn't answer. He let the silence serve as his verdict. The agents read Michael his rights as he was lowered into the back seat of the cruiser. The sirens flared once, a short bark that cut through the stillness before fading down the street. Thomas remained on the porch until the sound disappeared, until the last trace of flashing light vanished around the corner. Inside, the house felt different, lighter, though not in a way that comforted him. It was the lightness of aftermath, the kind that follows a storm once the wreckage has been cleared. He sat in his study, the recorder still tucked safely in the drawer, the photographs neatly stacked, every piece of evidence preserved. He had done what was necessary. He had defended himself. And yet the ache in his chest reminded him this wasn't victory. It was survival. He poured a drink, the glass trembling only slightly in his hand. He thought of Sarah again, of the promises made and the boy they had raised. He wondered if she would understand, if she would see this as justice or betrayal of a different kind. His heart whispered one answer, his head another. Still, he knew this wasn't the end. Arrests led to trials. Trials led to revelations. And Michael, cornered now, would not go quietly. He would claw. He would accuse. He would drag every secret into the open if it meant saving himself. Thomas stared out the window, watching the empty driveway where the car had once sat. His son was gone, but the storm he had unleashed was only beginning. The truth had been flipped, the trap inverted, but deeper shadows still waited to be uncovered. The next chapter promised to be darker, more dangerous, and Thomas knew he would have to walk it with the same cold precision that had carried him this far. The courthouse smelled of disinfectant and stale paper, a place where lives were dissected into transcripts and verdicts. Thomas sat in the back row, his shoulders rigid, his hands folded in his lap, staring at the polished wood of the defense table where his son sat in chains. Michael's face looked smaller under the fluorescent lights, his jaw unshaven, his eyes restless and red. There was no trace of the boy who had once asked for bedtime stories, no glimmer of the child who used to sit on the riverbank, waiting for his father to untangle a fishing line. What sat there now was a man hollowed out by desperation and a stranger in his bloodline. The prosecutor's voice was clinical as she laid out the evidence. The fentanyl found in the car. The phone records tying him to Marco and Elena. The forged documents, the fake signature that matched his hand more than his father's. And then the most damning detail of all, the recorded call to the DEA where he accused his father of possession. The courtroom seemed to shrink as the words replayed, echoing against the paneled walls. It was the kind of evidence no jury could ignore. Michael's lawyer tried to spin it as entrapment, as a misunderstanding, but his words fell flat. Even he seemed unconvinced. Thomas didn't flinch when the guilty verdict was read. He didn't look away when the sentence followed: 5 years in federal prison for possession, with intent to distribute, plus charges of making false statements to law enforcement. The gavel struck final and heavy, and the sound echoed in Thomas's chest like a slow heartbeat. Later, in the visiting room of the correctional facility, Thomas sat across from his son for the first time in months. The plexiglass barrier was clean, reflecting the harsh white lights above, and the phone receiver felt cold in his hand. Michael looked worn, his orange jumpsuit hanging loose on his frame, his face thinner than ever. He pressed his receiver to his ear and tried for a smirk, but it cracked halfway through. "You did this to me," Michael said, his voice low, bitter. "You set me up." Thomas's jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't waver. "No, son," he answered evenly. You did this to yourself." The silence that followed was heavier than chains. For the first time, Michael dropped his gaze, his bravado dissolving. The man who had tried to outwit the law now sat defeated on the other side of it, wrapped in the very uniform he had mocked in his father's warnings. When Thomas hung up the receiver, his chest ached, not from anger but from a hollow space where love and grief wrestled with finality. He had imagined this moment might bring closure, but it felt like standing over ashes, no flames left, only the weight of what had burned away. He walked out of the facility into the gray afternoon, the chain-link fences buzzing faintly, and the world beyond the gate felt both emptier and freer. The days that followed were quiet. Neighbors' whispered headlines faded, and life in the neighborhood moved on as though nothing had happened. Thomas spent mornings on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring out at the street, the silence around him broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the distant drone of traffic. He kept the documents, the photographs, the recordings in a locked drawer, a silent archive of betrayal. Not as trophies, but as proof to himself that he hadn't imagined it, that the nightmare had been real. At night, the house felt cavernous, its rooms echoing with the absence of voices. Sometimes he walked past Michael's old bedroom. The door closed, the air stale with dust. He wondered if redemption was possible, if prison walls could strip away the lies and leave something salvageable beneath. But the thought never lingered long. Trust once shattered did not grow back. And yet in the stillness he felt a strange release. The storm had passed, the chaos quelled by the cold efficiency of law. He no longer feared a knock at the door, no longer braced for the moment when his son's schemes would consume him whole. There was pain, yes, a father's pain, carved deep, but there was also a grim freedom in knowing the worst had come and gone. One afternoon, he drove past the correctional facility on his way to the hardware store. He slowed at the sight of the tall fences, the barbed wire gleaming in the sun, and thought of Michael inside counting the years. The image brought no satisfaction, no triumph, only a dull ache tempered by the knowledge that his son was contained, unable to harm him further. It was a kind of peace, though a bitter one. At home that evening, Thomas sat on the back porch, the tackle box resting at his feet. Empty now, just lures and hooks, and the faint smell of river water from trips long past. He traced his fingers over the lid, remembering the boy who used to beg for one more hour of fishing, one more cast before sunset. He let the memory linger, then fade, replaced by the stark present. He lifted his glass to the fading light and whispered to the wind, "It's over." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew the story wasn't finished. 5 years was not forever. And when Michael walked out of those gates, hardened by survival, shaped by the shadows of prison life, the true reckoning might only just begin. The house that had once held every echo of his life stood bare, stripped of warmth and history. Thomas walked through the empty rooms one final time, his boots thudding against hardwood that no longer creaked under familiar weight. The kitchen where Sarah had once laughed while stirring sauce was silent now, its cabinets vacant, the air heavy with the ghosts of dinners past. He paused in the living room, staring at the pale rectangle on the wall where their wedding portrait had hung for decades. The outline seemed brighter than the paint around it, a stubborn reminder that memory leaves marks, even when objects are gone. The decision to sell had not been easy, but it had been inevitable. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It had been forged into evidence, twisted into betrayal, and haunted by too many shadows. Every time he crossed the threshold, he heard Michael's voice accusing him, felt the cold weight of the fentanyl saw agents rifling through his belongings. A man cannot live where his trust had been gutted. So he signed the papers, handed over the keys, and turned his back on what was once his forever home. The apartment in Boulder was modest, but clean, perched on the edge of town, where the foothills began to rise into the Rockies. From the balcony he could see mountains stretching like an endless spine into the sky snow, already dusting their peaks, even as autumn clung to the trees below. It was smaller, quieter, easier to manage. There were no creaking floorboards, no hollowed bedrooms, No ghosts lingering in doorways. Just space enough for a bed, a chair, a kitchen table, and the few things he had chosen to carry forward. He unpacked slowly, deliberately, making sure each item had meaning. The tackle box, cleaned of its stain, sat in the corner beside his fishing rods. He ran his hand over its lid, not with suspicion now, but with the acceptance that it was simply a box again, a tool for quieter days on mountain streams. He placed Sarah's photograph on the windowsill, angled so that the light caught her smile every morning. Her absence would always ache, but here the ache felt gentler, softened by the clean air and the distance from what had been lost. Nights were still heavy, but different. Instead of the restless pacing of his son above him, he heard the muffled sounds of neighbors' laughter drifting through thin walls, the clatter of dishes, a television turned too loud. Ordinary sounds. Safe sounds. He sat on his balcony with a cup of coffee, listening to the wind in the pines, and for the first time in years, his chest did not feel like it was braced for impact. He spent mornings walking the trails, the crunch of gravel under his boots, the crisp mountain air filling his lungs. Sometimes he cast a line into the cold rivers, not to catch, but to remember. The act of fishing became ritual, a tether to the man he had been before. Betrayal reshaped him. Other retirees nodded in passing, offering small talk, but Thomas rarely spoke. Silence had become his companion, and he had learned to find peace in it. There were nights when guilt pressed against him like a cold hand. He thought of Michael behind bars, his son's eyes hollow as the cell door closed. No father should see his child reduced to that. But then he remembered the forged documents, the planted drugs, the reckless phone call to the DEA. The guilt gave way to clarity. Michael had not been destroyed by his father. He had been destroyed by his own choices. All Thomas had done was survive them. The lesson settled deep, carved into his bones. Family could betray as deeply as any enemy. Love could blind a man to danger until it was too late. And survival sometimes meant closing the door even on blood. He had spent his life defending the law, trusting it to protect order in a chaotic world. Now he had lived the truth of it in his own home. The law had taken his son, and the law had preserved his name. Both were realities he would carry forever. Evenings grew easier as the weeks passed. He learned the rhythm of the town, the slow shuffle of students at the nearby campus, the way the sky turned crimson before swallowing the sun. He read books he had never found time for, filled notebooks with reflections, and kept his body strong with morning routines. The ache of betrayal dulled, replaced by a steady calm. He no longer waited for the sound of a slammed door or the dread of a phone call. Sometimes he caught himself smiling when he thought of Sarah, not with the sharp sting of grief, but with the soft acceptance that love leaves imprints stronger than loss. He would sit by the window watching the mountains darken with dusk and whisper her name like a prayer. In those moments he felt her near, not as a ghost tied to the past, but as a memory guiding him into the future. The apartment was not grand, but it was enough. Enough space to breathe. Enough space to heal. Enough space to remind him that survival was not defeat. It was proof. Proof that he could endure the unimaginable and still stand. One evening, as the wind carried the faint smell of pine and snow into his home, Thomas sat with his tackle box open, running his fingers over the lures. He imagined taking them to a quiet lake in spring, casting a line as dawn painted the water gold. No DEA, no forged signatures, no sun waiting to betray him. Just the solitude of nature and the peace of his own company. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, and let the silence settle. He had lost much. A wife, a son, a house. But he had gained something, too. The wisdom that survival is not always about winning battles. It is about choosing which ones not to fight and finding peace in the aftermath. The past could not be erased, but it could be carried differently. He chose to carry it as a scar, not a wound, as a reminder, not a curse. And as the night deepened over Boulder, Thomas closed his eyes, knowing he had stepped out of the shadows of betrayal into the quiet truth of acceptance. The story was not happy, but it was his. And in its final measured way, it was enough. Life has a way of teaching its hardest lessons through the people closest to us. Thomas's story reminds us that even family, the ones we dedicate our lives to, can sometimes betray our trust. It is a painful truth, but one we must face with open eyes. Love should never mean blindness. Protecting what we have built, our homes, our names, our dignity, is not selfish. It is survival. For many older adults, the fear of being taken advantage of by those we love most is very real, but this story shows the power of vigilance and the strength of self-respect. We cannot always save those who refuse to be saved, but we can choose to stand firm and guard ourselves against being destroyed in the process. Acceptance, though bittersweet, is also freedom. It allows us to step forward into peace rather than remain chained to betrayal. If this message resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that reveal the struggles, resilience, and wisdom of life's later chapters.